JB, and all of you, I thank you very much for that. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm pleased to be in Scotland because I'm Scottish, but I'm also pleased to be talking about ethics in finance. To give you a bit of my background, I guess I've been involved in the responsible investment world now for about 30 years. I was the founder and the head of the responsible investment stuff that went on at Hermes. And I've been involved a lot, for example, with the United Nations in setting up the principles for responsible investment and bringing the finance industry to the Paris conference, the COP21. But in the last few years, I sort of left the investment industry, or I still work in the investment industry, but I've also had a position at universities as a professor and now a fellow at Cambridge University. And I'd like to really take two perspectives in what I'm talking about. The first really comes from some of that thinking I've done at the universities, because I know a number of you here are from universities. And then the second bit would just be, why can't we do this? And I would like to address the whole audience, especially the people who are asset owners and asset managers in that question. But look, as I said, I'm really pleased to be here talking about ethics in finance. Because if you look at the way that we teach economics, if you look at the way that we teach finance today, ethics is hardly part of it. And that's weird. Because we all want to go back to Adam Smith. Adam Smith, for those of you who don't know, was the professor of moral philosophy at Glasgow University. And the book that he thought was really his work of art was the theory of moral sentiments, not the wealth of nations. And that if you hadn't read about moral sentiments, that is how we feel towards one another, then you didn't understand how it was that markets could ever work. But actually, that's fallen off of our curriculum. And we have this strange relationship with money. You know, we think that it makes the world go around, but we know that it can't buy us love. And in fact, some of us even say that we think that money is the root of all evil. And yet, we know that we can't solve the big problems of the world unless we harness the power of money. Here's the weird thing, though. We know we can't do that, and yet in our political dialogue, there is no real agenda there for what we want the finance industry to do, what purpose we want it to serve. And that, to me, is bizarre historically as well. You know, I was in my 30s when the Berlin Wall fell down. During my childhood, for the first half of my life, we were willing to risk a nuclear war over who it was that controlled the financial assets, the ways and means of production. In fact, I don't know, have you ever been to Berlin, any of you? Yeah, you've been to Berlin, yeah. And you know there's that line down through the center of Berlin that marks where the Berlin Wall used to be. Some of the Berlin Wall's still there. And for 10,000 kilometers to the west, people thought that if you did anything about private ownership, that was such a suffocation of the freedom of the individual that you needed to allow capitalism, you needed to allow private ownership. And for the 10,000 kilometers to the east, there were the people who said, but the inequality that will bring about is so terrible that we need to control capital. And we were willing to go to a nuclear war over that just 30 years ago. So 30 years ago, the Berlin Wall falls, and we seem to have sort of forgotten about finance. We don't have an agenda for what it is that we want this industry to be doing. So we left it as a black box, studied by economists, modeled in Gaussian statistics about the risks that it was taking. And I guess most of us in this room even don't understand what Gaussian statistics are. I struggle sometimes. 20 years later, we had a financial crisis. Nearly brought the entire economy of the West to its knees because we had no agenda for what it was that we were going to be doing with finance. Indeed, so awful was that if you asked the British people today what they think about that, you don't get a good answer. The Bank of England did an interesting study. They went around, they talked to finance practitioners, but they also talked just to normal citizens and said, can you find me the one word that you would use to describe the finance industry? You know the word they chose? It's an ethical word, but it's not a good one. Corrupt. That here was an industry that was trusted to do something purposeful and important, and it used its powers to serve itself and not to serve the outside world that it was supposed to be there to serve. Corrupt. And look, this is Britain's most successful industry. This is 8% of our GDP. By the way, when I was young, it was about 2-3% of our GDP, so it's 3-4 times the size that it was when I was young. And you can see how people are saying, well, why is it so much better today than it was in those days when it's taking up so much more resource? And if we're not careful, people will push back on the finance industry, possibly in ways that are not constructive. And that'll be a real problem, because we need the finance industry. I can't see how we solve the problems of climate change, the problems of development, the problems of old age, the problems of health, the problems of education, unless we have the finance industry working behind this. And when I read the history of finance, and when I look at what's happening in finance, not so much in this country, but around the world, I'm struck by the incredible value that it can bring. You know, there's only one group of business people that I know of who have ever won the Nobel Peace Prize in my lifetime. They're financiers. Yeah. Here they are, Mossamet Begum and Mohammed Yunus for Grameen Bank. Now, for those of you who don't know Grameen Bank is a microfinance lender in Bangladesh. It lends money to poor people. It actually lends money mainly to poor women. And as a result, it's credited with taking hundreds of thousands of women who are farmers out of poverty. A fantastic achievement. But what Grameen Bank is doing is not different, technically, from what Wonga did. Yeah? It's lending money to poor people, but here it's done with purpose. For Wonga, it's done without any interest whatsoever as to how it is that it's helping the outside world. So what is the purpose of finance? You know, as I say, I teach at Cambridge, and I taught before at London Business School, and at no point were we challenging the students to answer that question, to say, what is it actually supposed to be there for? I'd like to suggest that there are some very, very basic things that we need to be demanding of the finance industry, and we need to be delivering of the finance industry. This would be them. Safekeeping. Place that I can put my money and know that I can get it out again. That's what a bank ought to do. By the way, it's just to give you an example, and I've only got so much time here, so I won't go into these in detail. But in Bangladesh, they invented something that's called the 10 taka account. 10 taka account. 10 taka is about 8 pence. If you've got 8 pence, you can open a bank account. I remember talking to Atiur Rahman, he was the governor of the Bank of Bangladesh. He said, it's the proudest thing I did, and the day I was most proud was when someone told me that street kids in Dhaka were opening bank accounts, because if you're a street kid and you get any money, you get robbed. Now they could keep their money safe. So that's in Bangladesh. In Britain, we've got 2 million people who don't have a bank account. I said to Atiur, but what do you do about all the problems with knowing your customer and, you know, drugs laundering and bribery and all this? I said, David, you know, I don't know too many people that put drugs launderers that put 10 pence into their account once a week. It really doesn't happen that often. So they found ways around it. It was purposeful. Transactions, of course, we need our transactions to be processed effectively. Again, if you go to Kenya and look at what M-Pesa's done, absolutely huge addition. Risk sharing. We had a woman from a Scottish Widows talking about 1812, people thinking about how do we share the risk that our husbands might go off to the Napoleonic Wars and not come back again. That's what insurance does. And the most important thing, borrowing and lending. So taking money from point A where it is to point B where it's needed, those of you that study finance will know it's what's called intermediation. Absolutely fundamental for a modern economy. And the problem is that if you do look at those purposes and you check out how finance is doing on them, the answer is it's not doing too well. And you'll know this from some of the stories that you'll have heard. Do you remember Adair Turner said, I think a lot of the things that are going on in the finance industry are not socially useful. Generous. Paul Volcker, that the only innovation in the last 30 years from the finance industry that was of any value was the ATM. And all the rest was just moving the rent around, moving the profits around. And what studies we have as well of intermediation suggest that if you look at how much it costs to take $1 from the real economy 100 years ago and take it through the finance system and invest it back again in the real economy, that cost is the same today as it was 130 years ago. The same cost, despite the most extraordinary technological developments. So anyone who comes to you and says, look, fintech will solve all of this, don't worry about it. 130 years we've had no productivity increase in intermediation in the finance industry at all. And finance needs to serve these four functions. It needs to serve these functions well. And we simply don't study it, and we don't talk about it, and we don't have it as an agenda for our regulators, and we don't have it as an agenda for our policymakers. And that's a problem. And that, I'd say, is the first thing that we need to do. And we need to say that from the industry. We need to say that in the way that we train people to enter the industry, and we need to say that as consumers of the industry as well. That's number one problem. But look, here's another thing. The reason we had the Cold War wasn't about whether or not you can get a bank account. The reason we had the Cold War was about the possible power of money, with the thought that there is going to be an ever smaller number of people who have a huge amount of wealth, and they will use that wealth to exploit the workers. And that they have the powers to do that through corporations because they own the shares and they can put in the directors and they can do all of those sorts of things. But before we run into that argument, it's worth just first asking ourselves, well, okay, who is it that all this money in the finance system belongs to? Here's a graph. This is for Europe. It's pretty well the same in the UK. But it's about a third in the way that the shares of companies are owned. A third are owned by, I've called them ordinary people. These are savings that are done through insurance policies or through pensions. A third comes from those ordinary people, again, from insurance and pensions from around the world. And then a bit less than a third is owned by governments, by corporations, and by individuals. There was one company I asked to do a calculation. How many people benefit when you pay a dividend? They gave up, and they went back and they said, okay, so it's this fund manager and they've got this pension fund money that they're looking at. They gave up when they came to 200 million. These corporations, the money that is in the financial system is our money. And we have the right to demand that that money is used in our interest. There are 30 million families, million people in Britain who have a pension. 30 million. All of them have some shares, most of it invested in hundreds and hundreds of companies. It's right that they should be demanding, that the finance industry demands that the companies they invest in are run on their behalf. So look, here's my 3-minute initiative before I have to get off the stage. I'd like to see this letter being written by asset owners, that's me because I have a pension, or you if you're Scottish widows and you've got 100 billion, which is a bit bigger than my pension. And I can't see that it makes any sense if I'm one of the millions of shareholders in a company that I would ever want that company to appoint directors who are not aware of the Paris Agreement and trying to get their company to operate according to the Paris Agreement, because if we don't get the Paris Agreement, we aren't going to have a sustainable planet. Now, the rights that are given to shareholders allow them to elect directors every year. And I'm just simply saying, look, if you've got my pension money, can you be sure that when you're using the shares the votes that confers upon you, that you're only electing people who will promise to try and run their company to their best efforts in a way that meets the Paris Agreement? Simple. By the way, if you're an asset manager, how about we write to the chair of the nominations committee or the chair of the board? Same thing. Climate change is a huge challenge for my clients and everybody else's future. I only want you to put forward individuals committed to manage the company in a way that's compatible with the Paris Climate Agreement. Simple. We could do that, couldn't we? Of course, people come back to me and say, well, you know, David, this is just absolutely pie in the sky, couldn't possibly do this. It'd be against the law for company directors to do that. Well, I had a little bit to do with the passage of the 2006 Companies Act. This is what we demanded that directors should do after a very, very long debate from very, very many different interested parties. It was to promote the success of the companies for the benefit of the members as a whole. Millions of people. That's what you're appointed to do under the law. And the person who talked about legal cases because you implemented climate change, I think, missed the point. These companies will be sued in 20 years' time, like the asbestos companies were sued in 20 years' time, unless they do something about this, because it's simply against their powers under Section 172 of the Companies Act, if they don't. So look, that's my little chat. The finance industry, people think it's corrupt. And yet, it provides services that are of utmost importance to any modern economy, that should be available to everyone, just as they're available to street kids in Dhaka. And we in the finance industry can do that. And by the ways, it also wields enormous power. But it only wields it because of our savings. The pension savings of Britain are 4 times larger than the combined wealth of the top 1,000 families in the Sunday Times Rich List. 4 times larger. And so if we're thinking about how we harness the power of money, let's think that it's our money, managed through a purposeful financial system. And I hope that gives you a few thoughts for the afternoon. I'm so pleased to be here. Thank you very much.